Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Well, it's been a very busy day, a day of a lot of talk so far. And the discussion groups, I know for some of you, you have felt that you may not have had enough time, and I'm sorry about that, but we're doing the best we can. To be here at all is a wonderful thing, quite frankly, I think. But as I said earlier, for those of you who would like to submit further information, suggestion, advice, please do so through the website. But now we've come to that important part of the day where we're going to hear brief summaries from each of the groups, and I'll be calling on them one by one. Now, this will take us right up to about 20 to 3. It's imperative we stick to time now because most of us are running very tightly to schedule to catch flights out of Brisbane, as much as we'd all love to stay here for the weekend, but many of us are on flights. And also, our first speaker, over here.
Who wants to go first?
Julie's first, so would you like to take a seat?
Okay.
Our first speaker, no, that's okay. I've popped Julie Mackay in first because baby Isabel is waiting and is demanding a feed. So we cannot hold her up any longer. Julie is going to give her summary and then disappear in about 10 minutes after that. So she's already given her apologies. Julie Mackay is the former CEO of UN Women Australia. She's the gender advisor to the Chief of the Defence Force and chair of the Queensland Male Champions of Change. And she was facilitating the organisational best practice group. So Julie.
Thank you, Virginia, and thank you, everyone. I won't do the thank yous to all of the various people that have pulled together today, but we are grateful for the opportunity to come together and discuss what we know are very, very complex and important issues. Our group, we're talking about the opportunity for organisations and particularly workplaces to take responsibility for violence against women and domestic and family violence, and to really think about the obligations that organisations have to their employees. And so we framed those as threefold. The first is to keep them safe. The second is to keep people experiencing violence or affected by violence in the workplace, because we all know that that's critical. And the third is the opportunity organisations have to demonstrate leadership in the community, so to actually set best practice. And we thought those three reasons guide the rest of our conversations. We did think that it was very important to acknowledge that any discussion about organisational responses to violence against women needed to be framed within the context of broader gender equity, and that without framing them in that context, you'd end up with a response that wasn't effective. And we also all acknowledge that organisations is a very broad term, ranging from government agencies to big business to small organisations to NGOs. And so in the response that we're proposing as comprehensive, we acknowledge that it will need to be tailored to the specific organisational context. We did also discuss the fact that we need to ensure that the education around why domestic and family violence is a workplace issue, is an organisational issue, is needing to be ongoing, because there's still a challenge with getting people to accept that it is something that workplaces need to take responsibility for. And the key point that was made in the group was organisations are already feeling the costs of domestic and family violence. This is simply about investing in protecting and supporting staff affected. So with regards to our best practice, we thought that the need is for a comprehensive response to domestic and family violence. A comprehensive response, we thought, had a couple of key components. The first is leadership. So leadership actually making commitments, using women's stories, and acknowledging that there's a lot of expertise already out there that they can draw from. We talked about the policy response. Domestic violence leave is one of the more publicly discussed responses, but that a policy response needed to be comprehensive, needed to include things like flexible work, needed to address issues of financial constraints, of transportation issues, of security issues. So an effective, comprehensive policy response. We talked quite a lot about training and the need to engage all of our staff in understanding at a broad level what constitutes domestic and family violence, particularly to engage men around what their role is in the workplace. We talked about depth and breadth needed in training and being able to share best practice. We discussed the need for partnerships, and we actually had the idea that there needs to be a national portal where people can share their best practice stories, their training modules, their case studies, so that anyone who's starting their journey in this space can actually start to build on what's already been discussed rather than starting again. And we had quite a detailed discussion about measuring outcomes, because obviously with any response, measuring outcomes is critical. And we thought that there needed to be 3 components there: a workforce survey, external evaluation, and data from support organisations being fed in. So that was our best practice model, and I know that's a lot of words in a short period of time. Our key insight was that domestic and family violence leave is critical to ensuring that people who are affected by domestic and family violence stay in the workforce, and that government has a role in role modelling best practice in this space. So the group did unanimously share the Premier's calls this morning for domestic violence leave to be incorporated into the National Employment Standards as part of a broader comprehensive response to domestic and family violence. So we hope that there's some key insights there. There'll be more detail in the notes that come out of the summit, and I'm sure the group would be happy to take any questions from you afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Julie. Perfect timing, right on 4 minutes. Well trained. We worked together on UN Women National Committee, and that's very impressive to hit the 4 minutes. A number of important points there, and the domestic violence leave, as we've heard, has been mentioned a number of times today, and interesting that your group thought that governments have a role in modelling that. And leadership, of course, from the Prime Minister down, it's quite clear that there is leadership commitment to this issue, but it's important to acknowledge this. And the idea of a national portal is such a great idea. I hope that that is one that we can take back to our workplaces and consider that actually becoming a reality, along with measuring outcomes, of course. So thank you very much to Julie and to the Roundtable involved in the organisational best practice. The next group is the innovative use of technology. This was facilitated by Maria Haggis. Maria is the Executive Director of Women's Safety Services. It was co-facilitated by Libby Lloyd, who is also with us, but Maria will do the feedback. Thanks, Maria.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to thank the group for all their wonderful insights, and I know that our minute taker has got a significant amount of notes, so I have really condensed this to the best of my ability. One of the things that we do recognise is that this is a new area and there is no base level of good practice, and now is our opportunity to develop those initiatives. So what we do know about some best practice, and certainly some principles of best practice for facilitating positive use of technology, is about integrated responses to information sharing across jurisdictions, and with jurisdictions that support women's safety. What we do know is that many jurisdictions are piloting many initiatives, and how is it that we can work collectively to bring those initiatives together, and how we can implement those initiatives that are successful nationally. And also, one of the things that we did talk about is how we can use technology to monitor perpetrator behaviours, and how we can engage the corporates to be part of that process and the solution, and particularly using social media platforms and telcos to increase women's safety through that process. Some of the challenges and areas requiring attention as we move into the use of technology raised by our group included access where mobile data coverage and signals are lacking, particularly an issue for women in rural and remote areas. Where we currently have initiatives in place such as apps, how can we safely retrieve that data to promote the safety of women and children, and how we do this in a coordinated way across jurisdictions and services. The need for increased data sharing across agencies and jurisdictions, as there are limitations and barriers, and particularly, for example, limits in privacy legislation, and particularly for the NGO sector, the majority of information is recorded on case notes, and how to migrate such information into a database is quite a complex process. Building workforce capacity across the sector that builds understanding and trust on the use of technology and keeping women safe. Any solution needs to consider the individual needs of women, including cultural needs and women with disabilities. One of the things that we did talk about was we recognise that, as I mentioned, there are great initiatives across Australia in a range of organisations, including government and non-government. Our group recommended the need for a panel group of experts across a range of industries to map existing initiatives and to build on those and implement nationally to avoid duplication across jurisdictions. This is about working together, avoid working in isolation to build on best practice nationwide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maria. Very tight and even under 4 minutes, so a gold star. Well done, thank you. Some very, some important innovations there. I really very much appreciate the discussion too about the increased data sharing and how best to do that, which was of course raised by some of the premiers earlier this morning as well. Wonderful. Moving on now to behavioural insights. Now, this group was facilitated by Marianne O'Loughlin, and Marianne is the Deputy Secretary of New South Wales Department of Premier and Cabinet. Marianne.
Thank you, and thanks very much to my team for sending me up here to report. We had, I think, quite a different topic. I think we all agreed with that because it's not really about best practice or services or support. Behavioural insights is about a different approach to public policy. It comes with a different mindset and a different method. And I just want to talk through that first. The mindset is away from conventional economics that says everyone is rational, self-interested, has perfect information. Behavioural science is really based in social and cognitive psychology. It's more realistic, empirically based about what influences behaviour and decision making. And really it focuses very much on what is called construal. There's not an objective world out there, but it's how we think about that world. And the idea is you've got to see the world through the person's eyes that you're trying to influence or get them to change their behaviour. And the second thing is the importance of context. Context matters hugely, and particularly your social context, who you're with, who you get influenced by, who influences who you influence, so what your social norms are. And so using that different approach, the method has 3 parts to it. When you're trying to change behaviour, and it was really important the group called out, it's not behavioural change as we usually think about it in this space. Behavioural insights is saying we're trying to change at a micro level. It's not a big macro reform agenda, it's very basic micro level, change a behaviour. So first understand what the specific behaviour you want to change and what the context is. Understand everybody's point of view, the victims, the perpetrators, the people around them. It's very data-driven and data around behaviour, not what people think so much as what do they actually do. It's really based a lot around field work. The second thing with that is we segment and target interventions. So they use a methodology that they call EAST. If you want to change behaviour, make it E, easy, A, attractive, S, social, use social norms, and T, timely. There are critical times for interventions. And the third bit of the methodology is test, learn, adapt. So particularly we use randomised control trials. We try and work out what actually works. If it doesn't work, stop doing it. If it works, do more of it. What impact does it have? In New South Wales, we have a behavioural insights unit, and we use these behavioural insights trials across policy areas, but we are working in the area of domestic violence with the Premier's priority to reduce reoffending of perpetrators. So I'll give you a couple examples of what we've been doing. An example is 30%, we know, so this is data-driven, of perpetrators don't come to court. We want to change that behaviour. And how we're doing it is sending text messages 24 hours before they're meant to turn up. Simple, it's inexpensive, it's very timely, and so far interim results are we've got an 11% improvement in the number of perpetrators who come to court. That reduces the stress and anxiety of the victim. It means the perpetrators are engaged with the court process and the court can intervene more. So that's just a really quick example. The action that came out of this was around jurisdictions. If we are interested in doing this work, sometimes it's very difficult to test these ideas with our small sample sizes, so we could get together more and pool our sample sizes to test something together. We could identify key ones to work on, even if they're quite small ones. It isn't a silver, gold, platinum, not even a brass bullet. These are small changes that can have bigger impacts along the line that we can build on. And we can see how that works. And we can see how it works for different people and different contexts. So there's a lot of people in our group who had some ideas of how to do this and that they were interested in. One of them was an idea around controlling behaviour, not physical. These people don't go to court often, they don't get arrested, but we're trying to interrupt their escalating behaviour, perhaps with a timely intervention that through behavioural insights can stop their controlling behaviour escalating. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Marianne. Some fantastic stuff there. And this is, as you said, a rather new area or way of looking at the issues surrounding violence against women and children. But some marvellous stuff. And I really liked the reference to East. If we want behaviour change, make it easy, attractive, focus on the social norms and timely. That's something that we could all focus on. And understanding the behaviour that we want to change, actually focusing on behaviour. Very helpful. Thank you very much for that. Our next group was the group looking at the effects of violence against women and children in Indigenous communities. And the CEO here is, I beg your pardon, the facilitator here is Andrea Mason, who is the CEO of the NPY Women's Council. Andrea. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women discussion. Right. Thank you.
Please make welcome Amanda to the stage. He did all the writing down for us. So we had, I think, the biggest group in the room, and it was an incredible discussion. So I thank everyone who was in my roundtable for a very, I think, robust but also very insightful discussion. There is an incredible level of energy that's in the room, particularly in our roundtable, which bodes well for this National Action Plan. People working on the ground, people working in government, people working as members of Parliament, and there were some very strong themes coming through everyone in the group. So what I felt, because there was such an incredible level of information that was raised during the first session, that in terms of insights, I asked the group to give me one or two words to capture the principles in the discussion we had in the morning. So this is what I'd like to read out now. A very strong cornerstone word was Aboriginal empowerment, which came through right the way through the morning discussion. Holistic and resilience was another key two phrases. Then these are all words that were included in the mix of the discussion this morning. Linking up, collaboration, culturally appropriate, child-centred, recalibrate the policy and service system, gender equality, trauma-informed practice, place-based, sharing authority, equal opportunity, understanding drug and alcohol as a risk, and the key phrase with everyone at the table, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, was that if this was going to work, that if we're going to see real change, it must be Indigenous-led. Moving on to the next session, it's talking about examples of best practice. So keeping those words and principles in mind, we looked at three areas: support, services and partnerships. And then I also invited everyone in the group to, again, talk about areas that they felt were good examples of best practice, as well as, if they could, an example in the community. So we had men and boys prevention, and the No More campaign was mentioned there. girls and women's empowerment, and there was discussion from a leader in the area of Girls Academy Ranger program for young children or young kids. We had Sisters Day Out in Victoria and Dillybag and Save a Brother, which was reference to drug and alcohol and DV services in the ACT. Talking about services that provide good practice, family violence prevention and legal services, Victoria, therapeutic interventions. We had healing centres, and there was a reference to the good work that the Healing Foundation has done. I put down the think tanks, men and women think tanks coming out of NPY Women's Council around emotional literacy as a precursor to developing solutions to reduce violence and child abuse. We had a great discussion around the Kimberley Partnership Framework, and the representative talked about a very practical example of CDP having activities which are approved around personal empowerment, and that being obviously something that is an investment in the community. Walking with Dads was another one mentioned under services, and then partnerships, partnerships seem to be a very strong theme, that we can't do this by ourselves. We will see a greater good as sectors work together, organisations work together, governments work together, and the whole of the sector works together. So there were examples around quality control, one-stop holistic services. For example, we talked about the Kimberley Partnership Initiative, and this was particularly around Kimberley Children, their initiative. And that came under the umbrella of the Empowered Communities Initiative, which is a national governance initiative. Co-location and integration was mentioned by one of the leaders. So not only integration of services, but co-location, so being embedded in each other's organisations to see things firsthand. An example was the Family Safety Framework. And the last example is Tribal Warriors and Clean Slate, those programs that are based in New South Wales and are great examples of partnership. Cheers.
Thank you, Andrea. There was some terrific discussion on that table that I sat in on at one stage, and lots of great initiatives being talked about, and I particularly liked the idea or the discussion around sharing authority. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. The next group was discussing diverse experiences, and this is facilitated by Jumana El-Matra, and Jumana is the Executive Director of the Australian Muslim Women's Centre for Human Rights, Commonwealth. Jumana.
Thank you. Our group, I think, felt that we had one of the more difficult tables because there were a range of communities that needed to be reflected on and considered, and diversity in this context meant called women, women with disabilities, LGBTI communities, and men who were victims of violence. So our brief was really quite challenging. So one of the first things we thought to do is, by way of recommending what we think would be good practice, is actually to establish an advisory committee to look at the implementation of the National Action Plan. The National Action Plan does have committees that have been set up, but it doesn't include one for communities, and we think this would be really important. This working group would not only look at the conceptual and technical aspects of applying the National Action Plan, but would also look at how to make the system more accountable and put the burden on the system to service communities and women rather than expecting women to make their way through the system. Additionally, we wanted to really look at overhauling the entire assessment process that we do with people who've experienced violence, and to make that assessment incorporate the intersectionality of people's identities, but also the intersectionality of the challenges that they face. In this regard, we also looked at and thought it important the development of a case management model or case managers model that takes people from the crisis experience right through to recovery and establishment of life post the violence. We also talked about the need to have a very person-centered approach, or a client-centered approach, that is a model in which no assumptions are made about the person in front of you, and that the person is supported to make or choose options that are appropriate for them, including potentially not leaving a perpetrator of violence. We thought that there was a really important need for targeted information that's still lacking in the sector, that recognises individuals' context and recognises that violence is specific to their context and is informed by their context, and that types of violence women in those and men in those communities face may not be general forms of violence that we talk about generally. We also thought that the way in which government currently funds, especially its focus on project short-term funding or universal funding that's supposed to deal with anyone who experiences violence, really needed to be looked at and considered in terms of its impact on communities and its tendency to, in fact, marginalise communities from service provision. We had a good model that we looked at, which was the emergency response package, and we thought that was a good model that potentially could be looked at by way of nationalising it. Key insights include that the language that we use to represent violence against women and minorities does not reflect the experience of those minorities. The communication and media strategies that we've developed to date, it's a good start, but they don't reflect how women with disabilities may experience violence, and certainly not the way CALD women do, or communities, LGBTI communities. The language itself, the terminology, family violence, domestic violence, is not appropriate in terms of how some communities experience violence. It doesn't recognise key differences between intimate partner violence, violence in the home, violence in institutions, violence in the community. It doesn't reflect that experience appropriately. We also talked about the the justice system, that it continues to use inappropriate understandings of power, control and violence. Its focus is narrow in that regard and doesn't look at the context of the person. We also finally talked about the degree to which men, as victims of violence, are to be included within our strategies to eradicate violence, and how that is to be integrated in our system that works with women in a way that does not undermine the status of women as victims and is not hijacked by men seeking to undermine women's safety and deny the fact that women experience unacceptable forms of violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jumana. Some marvellous things there, and of course the inclusion of men as victims, which hasn't been discussed at great length today, but that was a great discussion at your work table. And of course the issue of language, the language used. This is a vexed one for all of us, and certainly for media. I think this is something we just haven't quite worked out. And your reference to violence, particularly in marginalised communities, being specific to context is a very important one too. So a number of issues there for further consideration. And Jumana mentioned the justice system. Well, let's go straight now to the next work table, roundtable, that did look at justice and family law, and this was facilitated by Magistrate Kate Hawkins from Victoria.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you to my group for all the hard work and incredible insights you all have. And if we'd had another 3 days, we might have been able to do justice to this topic. But we came up with 5 key outcomes as a result of our discussions about how to reduce risks to families affected by family violence, navigating our state and national court systems. The first point we arrived on was the real need to protect victims through all court proceedings. And there's a number of suggestions that we came up with, practical suggestions about how this might be achieved. Firstly, to impose a bar on the direct cross-examination by a perpetrator of a victim in any family law or family violence proceeding, wherever that is, whether it's a state court or a federal family law court. Furthermore, giving victims the opportunity to give evidence remotely by alternative means such as video links. And thirdly, and very importantly, to ensure that there is adequate legal assistance in all jurisdictions for people affected by family violence. Our second key theme was directed to ensuring that victims only have to tell their story once. So once throughout their whole court journey, which might begin in a state court and might end in a federal family law court. And that could be enabled by the use of various technologies, including things like having a recorded video statement admitted as evidence in all courts. Thirdly, the concept of information sharing is key to ensuring safety. So there needs to be a method of sharing of all court orders, including orders from the family law courts, child protection orders, and state court intervention orders. That is updated, is dynamic, and can be accessed by all who need that information. Fourthly, very important, is a national consistency of key concepts and tools, including a common risk assessment framework tool, some shared family violence literacy, including a common definition of family violence and the best interests of the child. And fifthly, and perhaps most importantly, is putting children at the front and centre of every court process. Extending the ability of state courts to intervene to suspend family law orders where there is an imminent risk to the child, and ensuring legal and cultural recognition that family law processes are reviewed to ensure that a parental entitlement to contact is not prioritised over the safety of that child. And to that end, we'd seek that Part 7 of the Family Law Act be reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Magistrate Kate Hawkins, and some very powerful initiatives and suggestions there, particularly putting children at the front and their safety at the front of the process. And the idea, when we're talking about technology so much today too, the idea that victims only tell their story once is something that should be very doable. So a great idea to put that on the national agenda. Thank you. Our seventh roundtable was all about children. This group was facilitated by Megan Mitchell, and Megan is the National Children's Commissioner.
So, Kate, that was music to our ears, and I'd just like to thank, we didn't have a table, we had a circle, because like you, we decided to move the furniture around, many of you, and we went outside and got in trouble from security. But it all worked out in the end, and I had a brilliant group of people with a lot to say, and I'm sure there's much more that that I could relay to you, and I hope that all of their brilliant ideas get recorded somewhere, and that this is the beginning of a conversation only. So I just wanted to make the point that many of the folk in that group were a little disappointed or concerned that children still seem to be a bit of an add-on in this conversation about family and domestic violence, despite the fact that they are affected in huge numbers, both as witnesses and as direct victims. And also there was a discussion that, you know, you cannot approach issues around children from a gendered lens alone. And you need to acknowledge the power imbalance between adults and children that exists. And that often means that adults cross a line in front of children and against children. And again, we too decided that the best thing to do for all of us was to have children at the centre of system design, and that systems needed to be accountable to those children and culturally responsive. And when I say accountable, that goes to the information that we need to regularly report on that ensures that we're monitoring what's happening to kids and whether our interventions are working or not. We also, there was a lot of discussion about children needing services and supports that are different to those of adults, but that doesn't necessarily exist at the moment, and that while there are some therapeutic supports available, it's pretty piecemeal and ad hoc around the country, and that these things should be available statewide, nationwide, to a particular set of standards. Another issue that was discussed was that we need to put a strong focus or a focus on children as victims of assault within the family context, including sexual abuse. And we also thought that it was really important to bring national federal plans around child protection and family violence, and state plans, in fact, for that matter, and child protection and family violence together, because they're just such interrelated issues and the systems work across them all. It was also incredibly important to the group to find ways to hear children's voices across the service system so that they are visible, empowered, and willing to seek help if they need it, and that they can get help and they know who to go to. We also just had a little discussion about perpetrator programs and the issue that many current parenting programs don't actually address perpetrator behaviour, and they won't work if they don't. We also talked about information sharing protocols across the states and territories and the court systems, the child protection systems, the family violence systems, and the need for information sharing standards and protocols to be implemented across the nation. We also talked about the fact that people at the coalface need education about the impact of domestic violence on children, and this goes everything from health professionals to teachers and early childhood educators. And to help them also to have those difficult conversations with parents and children that they feel uneasy about at the moment, and to link them with the services and supports they need. We also noted that research was required on the experience of children in the area of family violence and in different contexts and in terms of interventions that work, and noted the link between poverty and children's experience of family violence, and that needed some significant research. I think I'll just end with a good example. We talked about the need for partnerships across the service system for things to work. And one example was the Eastern Family Violence Regional Partnership in Victoria that brings together the expertise and knowledge and resources around children. That includes, for instance, therapeutic services, men's services, police, child protection, education, health. And that was the kind of model that we needed to replicate so that we could share information and build knowledge and build expertise. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Mitchell, and some marvellous suggestions there. And particularly, of course, about putting children at the centre of system design. And as Magistrate Hawkins said a moment ago, if we only had 3 days, we could perhaps even scratch the surface of this. We don't, we only have today. But as you've just pointed out, Commissioner, it is the beginning of a conversation. And this conversation, now that we've started it, it won't stop. I'm sure of that. Our last round table, and indeed they're not round tables, but U-shaped tables, our working group, the 8th one, it was discussing tech-facilitated abuse, and this was facilitated by Professor David Lacey, and David Lacey is the Managing Director of IDCare.
Thanks, Virginia, and thanks, Working Group, for your great input to hopefully what I'll do justice in communicating it to the broader group. We looked at the technology-facilitated abuse topic from 2 lenses. One's the problem context, and within that, the abuse that we're seeing in terms of text and SMS, imagery, identity and personal information abuse, and of course the devices themselves. And the second lens that we applied to the problem was the response context, and that in terms of prevention through education and awareness, and of course the response journey that women experience when it comes to technology facilitated abuse. In relation to best practice, there's pockets of really inspiring activity that was communicated across the working group. In relation to education, there were two themes to emerge from that. One was the need for a cultural shift and change in accepting that the online environment is just as impactful and the response needs to be treated in that way. The other was the need or the gap that exists in knowledge with technology coming onto the market and the need to rapidly acquire knowledge as to how that technology might be abused and how to work within the means of that technology for all the positives that can come from it. The benefits and the pockets of really interesting work, we highlighted the Spinifex State High School in Mount Isa and the formalising of the education of technology within that environment. We found great interest in the work that was going on with the Children's E-Safety Commissioner and WESNet in continuing to roll out training to service providers on technology and the capturing in particular of evidence. The forthcoming Technology Safety Summit was identified as a great initiative and one that we're excited about, no doubt, moving and growing in years to come. The development of new communities of interest, work that Facebook's been doing with the Queensland Government, and we also turned our minds offshore and looked to see what was occurring by way of police having access to diagnostic technologies where women can go, provide their device and have that device, the evidence captured of that to inspire a response effort and make perpetrators accountable. In terms of opportunities and other issues, notwithstanding those pockets of inspiration, there was acknowledgement of the need for women when confronted with technology facilitated abuse to have a greater rapid response capability. And with that, the opportunity that civil penalties might come in doing so. Certainly need for more data and understanding through research, the opportunities that government might present in coordinating some of that. We took some issue with the term revenge porn. By implication, it would suggest that there's been some precursor event that's necessitated revenge, and we think that that needs to be revisited and a more appropriate term considered. We saw the need for business, technology providers, and seeing how we might leverage work that's been done and understanding what those technologies and applications may be used from an exploitation perspective, and looking at new communities that can share that information to the community to promote safe practice and response. We saw the need in terms of education to recognise that there may be a requirement to tailor the education and awareness to the particular generation in question and identify where there might be intergenerational consistencies as well, and always one eye on the future and how we might address and predict what might happen with advances such as biometrics and drones and the impending, if not already here, Internet of Things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Lacey. And again, a whole bunch of interesting applications considered there in regard to some of the potentially positive uses of technology, and particularly in tracing the perpetrators such that you can make perpetrators more accountable. But of course we have the downsides with technology too, which was discussed. Now, Unfortunately, we have to leave it there. There is so much more we could talk about, but time is against us. I'm going to ask our facilitators to stay here on stage as we move into the closing remarks to bring this summit to a close. But I would just reiterate that it is the beginning of a conversation. As has been said a number of times today, COAG has never spent a day and brought everyone together in such an incredible high calibre selection of delegates to talk about this issue. So whilst we may not all feel satisfied that all our concerns have been addressed and our differences resolved, we nevertheless have started a national discussion. It's on the table now, and it is up to all of us to continue that discussion.